And institutions. It's Friday, January 24th. This is our morning meeting, and we have with us Doug Farnham, who's our Chief Recovery Officer, who is dealing with FEMA and working with, particularly our focus right now is working with the Capitol Complex in terms of the flooding that occurred during the summer of 23. It did impact our Capitol Complex substantially. And many of the buildings were offline for a number of months, and many of them have now come back online. But there's also a handful of buildings that at some point we're going to have to make a decision in terms of what we do with them because they're not inhabitable with this. It's tied into our insurance. It's tied into FEMA. And it's also tied in what do we do long term for this. And any of the buildings, the other thing, Doug, too, I don't know. Some of the buildings that are back online, are we going to have to do any renovations in there in terms of the mechanical systems? Because all the mechanical systems in all of our buildings are in the basement. And that's what floods. You lose your circuit box, you lose your elevators, you lose your HVAC systems, you lose everything for the mechanical parts of that building. So we may have to, at some point, move all that up to a different floor, which has ramifications. So Doug, welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
If you could introduce yourself for the record.
The record, Douglas Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer for the state. In my portfolio is primarily the American Rescue Plan Act state fiscal recovery funds that we're still administering. I used to administer the coronavirus relief funds, and those are still under audit. The emergency rental assistance funds, we received 350 million. Not a B, M, 350 million for emergency rental assistance. And that was under my role as deputy secretary. When the floods happened last summer, the governor appointed me chief recovery officer and added to allow me to focus on flood recovery for municipalities, the state, individuals, and businesses. So anything to do with recovering from the flood, long-term and short-term. I'm kind of overseeing and coordinating. Most of the actual activity happens in BGS for the Capitol Complex, Vermont Emergency Management for working with the towns, ACCD for working with businesses. But I try to, and A&R, of course, is central to pretty much all of that because everything has to flow through our environmental checks and processes and permitting. And I try to make sure that everyone's talking to each other, everyone's working well with each other. If we're hitting roadblocks, they're for good reasons. They're not for, nonsensical reasons, which we sometimes have in government, right? And of course, working with our federal partners, FEMA being the biggest one, especially for the Capitol Complex, but also USDA Rural Development. On many projects, they invest a surprising amount, mostly in municipal infrastructure. The Economic Development Authority, that gets involved in the long-term recovery planning process. And then, of course, the Environmental Protection Agency, mostly for wastewater treatment facilities, other water and wastewater, stormwater projects. So to level set on the July 2023 floods, I always lose the number, if it was 14 sites or 17 sites, but I think it was 17 sites that were impacted. The two biggest ones in the complex.
Out of how many sites are there? Like 20?
They're right around 20.
Four.
One of the biggest pieces of information to share with the committee is that the DMV building did a floodproofing project 6 or 7 years ago. Not a full overhaul of the building, but kind of what we call a little bit of dry floodproofing to try to keep the water out. And also the utilities in that building, while they're unfortunately like at or below grade, are not as far below grade as we have in other buildings. So the floodproofing was able to, buy us valuable inches and feet. Sometimes a matter of 6 inches is what costs you millions of dollars. So the DMV building, I believe, only suffered a couple $100,000 of damage due to that floodproofing project. So that was a big win for that. The heat plant, which was built more recently, suffered almost no damage. And that is, of course, very close to the river. It was just built more recently, built in the appropriate way, and it weathered the storm pretty well. Most of the buildings along the riverside near the state auditor's office, the Secretary of State's building, the Green Mountain Care Board building. Those were significantly impacted, water up to 4 or 5 feet on the first floor. And one thing that happened because of the saturation, when we talk about July 2023 floods, we had, rain. FEMA declared the incident starting on July 7th. That's about when the rain started. They ended the federal declaration on the 21st of July, which is an extremely long declaration for them. We had to fight for 9 months to get that declaration period. We wanted through August 5th because between July 7th and August 5th, there was rain. Literally, there were not even 2 days in a row where there wasn't any rain. So the water tables were all saturated, the ground was saturated, and that played into the impact on the Capitol. Primarily, the most expensive impact being in 109 and 109 that way.
109, which is the pavilion.
The pavilion.
New members here. So
Yeah.
when Doug is talking about State Street, it's State Street right here. DMV is across the road from the Capitol.
Right.
So it's all those buildings, some of those buildings on that side of the street that really got the impact. 133 State Street over here got a tremendous amount of impact, though that's up and running now. And then the Pavilion building got tremendous. We lost the auditorium there. We lost a lot on the basement floor. So the Pavilion's over there, everything across the street, all the way over here to 133.
Yes,
It
and
was
Incredible.
unreal. And the river, of course, is right behind all of those buildings on the other side of State Street.
right. And the water levels were between like the 100-year and the 500-year. I don't believe that we actually hit the 500-year level for the surface water. But what complicated it dramatically is that the ground was so saturated and the rain had been coming for so long that the pumps stopped working, right? You couldn't put the water anywhere. So in normal plans, you plan for a flood that lasts a day or two and you're able to pump water out. But because the ground was saturated, it was literally coming up from everywhere. It was coming through the utility tunnel. The water was just saturating everything. And that's why we had higher water levels inside the building and in those two buildings in particular. Also, some of the utilities and extremely expensive electrical equipment, transformers, things like that, are below grade, in some cases, like 20 feet below grade. And one of the things about equipment like that, that was identified as a risk multiple years ago. But to move a piece of equipment, it costs the same amount. So generally, if it's working and it's in place, you just use it until it breaks. And then, so nothing was installed recently that low below grade, but they were all, put in like 80s, 90s, 2000s, before we really started to be more cognizant of flood codes and trying to lead more by example. So that flooding occurred. We got the FEMA team on the ground. I think at this point, we've probably had a dozen inspections of the Capitol grounds by FEMA personnel. One of our main challenges has been turnover on the team,
The FEMA
on
team,
the FEMA team,
not on the state team.
not on the state team.
Is that because of a different administration coming in, or is it just attrition, or?
It's an unfortunate aspect of FEMA's business. So there's a couple elements. There's one thing that they call a 50-week rule, where the IRS says if someone's in a location for 50 weeks, their per diem becomes taxable after that certain point.
Oh,
So FEMA rotates people around so that they don't hit that and
yeah.
then become taxed on things that are actually just supporting their subsistence. So the congressional delegation is aware of that problem. It's a federal problem. It's not anything that FEMA can solve. It's something that the Congress would have to address because it's not an IRS regulation. It's written into law.
It's a 4-year cycle, basically.
Well, the other problem is that with weather becoming more unstable or inclement conditions, FEMA relies heavily on temporary staff, retired personnel, contractors, and pulling those people on, they're often unpredictable. They're often not on a team for a long amount of time. So after about a year, So in May of 2024, in March of 2024, we started having some more aggressive conversations with FEMA about we're not making progress that we need to make. Like we both want this project to move forward. We're not making progress because people keep turning over. We keep restarting. You ask us for a document, we send it to you, and then you send back a bunch of different questions. And so we got a leadership changeover on the FEMA side that was helpful and we pulled together a complex projects team with FEMA and the state to work things like the wastewater treatment facilities, which are now actually in a really good place from a planning perspective, getting close to like a FEMA offer, and the capital complex. I would say we're still pushing through some fundamental disagreements with FEMA. One example is with all the electrical work, the electricity that was submerged under state and national fire code, that must be replaced. We've received a temporary operating permit so that we can continue the functions of state government, but the fire marshal has been very clear, you have to replace that. FEMA is challenging whether or not that actually needs to be replaced, which doesn't make any sense to us.
So I think one thing too,
Yeah.
people need to understand about FEMA. FEMA is a reimbursement.
Yes.
They'll pay after the fact, after you do the repairs or do the moving of the equipment. So you've got to kind of have some money put on the table to begin with.
Yes.
To do the work, either through your insurance or you find money through the general fund or the capital bill or something, but you have to have that approval of FEMA before you go forward. Because if
Yes.
you don't, then FEMA won't reimburse you for
Right.
those costs.
Yeah. For
That's an
permanent.
important piece to remember.
So for temporary work, for temporary repairs, we generally have to go ahead without FEMA's approval. And then we hope that they'll reimburse us later. And, we argue over details, but generally we get reimbursed for temporary work as long as we follow the spirit of it being temporary. For permanent work, that's absolutely true, Madam Chair. We have to get them to agree to what permanent work is merited based on the damage and what our codes and standards require. And that's where we still are working through just a disagreement on how to set that number with FEMA. We had a deadline on January 14th with FEMA to set the project budget.
This January?
Yes. We were unable to make that with them, and so we got a 6-month extension. So right now we have until July 14th to set the project budget for the capital complex repair. And that will get us what FEMA is willing to contribute to the repair and mitigation of the capital complex.
So
And we obviously hope to not go right up until July. We want that as soon as possible.
what would that project budget include? Is it moving some of the mechanicals, like from 133 and 109? Is it moving some of that? Is it, how do we go forward with some of the buildings that are not inhabitable right now? Is that all included in that budget process, the project?
So what FEMA will base a project budget off of is the cost to repair and mitigate in place without moving the actual building. So repair and mitigate up to codes and standards. And so one factor in that has been we have a flood hazard area river corridor rule from ANR that is more proactive than most other states. So FEMA has been litigating with us over how that rule applies to the capital complex. We hold ourselves to the same standard we hold private buildings, and we're just working through that with FEMA. I think we've been making progress, but yes, so take 133 State Street, for example. What FEMA will pay for and what we're working towards getting them to acknowledge and put a number on is to repair and replace the HVAC, the electrical. That's most of the cost of the damages to that building. They have to be moved above base flood elevation, I think +3 or 4, like a couple feet above the 100-year flood level, so that it's unlikely that they would ever get, never impossible, but unlikely that they would get impacted again. And then when those utilities are being moved up, we're going to lose square footage in the building. So FEMA has to pay for the replacement square footage within that structure. So how do you restore the building to its previous functionality? I know it's much more than this, probably about 20,000 square feet of usable business space with the utilities. There's a lot of different ways that you could achieve that square footage replacement. And that's like a phase 2 with FEMA. That's not something we agree on in the first step. The first step is just how much would it cost to, and we do that amount for every building in the Capitol complex. And then, so we have a line item for every building, what it would take to repair and mitigate in place. We add all of that up and we agree to that budget with FEMA. And then we develop a plan that recognizes the historical character of our downtown, that tries to mitigate impacts on the neighbors of the Capitol complex. Because, for instance, our chillers have been outside since the flood, and it is impacting people in Montpelier pretty significantly. We are stuck between a rock and a hard place on what to do about that right now, because that gets complicated. Sorry, but we need to develop a plan that takes into account the needs of the neighborhood, the needs of the Capitol, and then but we need the dollar amount from FEMA that they'll approve for the base budget in order to develop that plan. We did in the budget last year, either budget or BAA, $30 million was set aside for FEMA match. The estimated need for FEMA match for the state for 2023 floods was $37 million. That assumes the Capitol complex repairs will cost approximately $200 million. So 90-10 match, we pay 20 million out of the 200 million. Some of our conversations with FEMA have been almost absurd, to the point of like them saying, well, 133, the way we calculate, only has $5 million of damage. And just unhelpful from a starting point. So, I mean, any negotiation can go in that manner, but I do expect the Capitol complex project to be somewhere in that $200 million range.
So that would include buildings that are up and running now, but that would include moving the mechanics and all of that in those buildings, as well as trying to figure out the 4 buildings that are currently inhabitable.
Yes. And also decisions like, and nothing has been decided here, we put in an application for a buyout of the Green Mountain Care Board building, because that's a newer building. It's right at the end. It's not historic. It could be potentially converted to green space. So we put in an application to preserve that option. But of course, we would never move forward with that buyout and clearing that building without legislative approval. But that's definitely, that singular decision point will be part of almost any plan we put together, knowing just that building was newer.
Yeah, but it was, I mean, the water came up that didn't have a base.
Right.
So the first floor, I mean, the water was up. It was up.
And so in many cases,
It wasn't up to the ceiling, but it was pretty close.
Since we haven't had permanent work approved in any case by FEMA for any Capitol complex building, what I directed BGS to do was repair the buildings in a temporary state to protect them, make sure we're not getting any further mold, allow for temporary operations, because doing that temporary operation is much cheaper, much more cost effective than leasing space somewhere else to house those displaced staff. And also the tax department, for example, we have very expensive scanning equipment that cannot reasonably be moved to another building. It would be massively expensive to relocate that equipment to another location, much less if we could even find a location that could house those large scanners and have the right temperature controls and other things that have been built in that building. So we had to get the buildings up and operating on a temporary basis. And even that has been a back and forth with FEMA over, well, sheetrock is a permanent repair. It's like, well, we had exposed electrical, so we covered it up with sheetrock so that people didn't get electrocuted.
They tore down walls to get out the moisture.
Yes. It all had to be gutted. There were, God, it seemed like several hundred staff from ServPro, the contractors that were helping to do the mold remediation and get the moisture, get the damaged material, get the moisture out of those buildings. And so I think we're getting closer to a place where we can start to reach agreement with FEMA leadership. It is frustrating to be in this place after a year and a half.
The thing with FEMA too, because we went through this with replacing the Waterbury complex, state hospital and all of that at the time. And I don't know if this is different now, but FEMA would only cover what you lost to bring it back to what it was before the loss.
Right.
If you went beyond that, FEMA at that time would not cover if you went beyond what was currently there at the time of the loss. We negotiated a little different, but it took some work on our part for that. But FEMA only comes in supposedly and pays to repair to what it was, not above that, not beyond that.
Right.
If you go beyond that, you could jeopardize your whole FEMA reimbursement or a good portion of it.
I think that unlike Waterbury, the land is graded here on the Capitol complex, at least on the hillside, much differently than in Waterbury. So I think we will be able to present some options that don't require additional investment of funds beyond the budget that FEMA provides us, and preserve the character of the complex, potentially add some green space. I think the idea that we're working on now is we get the budget locked in with FEMA. With Waterbury, it took us 2 years. 2 years will happen in July. I was really hoping to beat Waterbury's timeline, but it doesn't look like I'm going to be successful at that. But we need to get the budget locked in of how much FEMA will put into our project. Once we have that, we'll develop 3 or 4 options working with BGS to present to the legislature. Last year, an oversight committee was created, a joint committee from House Corrections, and it was Senate
institutions along with the Joint Fiscal Committee. It's what we did with Waterbury.
Right. We use the same approach that was used in Waterbury. So we'll likely need to use that joint committee out of the legislative cycle to review and approve any plans that the administration agrees to with FEMA on, okay, we have the FEMA budget. This is the plan. Or these are the options. That committee works to select a path forward, and then we can begin construction.
I wonder if we're going to have to I wonder that we did that in a capital bill last year. I wonder if it's going forward or we're going to have to do it again.
I reviewed the language, Madam Chair, and it didn't have an end date. It didn't have a dissolution process. I was trying to remember if the Senate committees were renamed or not. I don't know if that would be an actual problem or if Ledge Council wouldn't care about that.
Yeah, I don't know. We'll have to flag that, make sure for that. So for the committee, Mary, I know, just hold off a bit. For the committee, none of the standing committees can act off session. We don't have the authority to act when we're not in session. So when we adjourn in May, we can work or continue meeting once in a great while if we have to, but we can't take any action per se that's going to be able to be carried out. The only committees that can take any legislative action when we are adjourned is the Joint Fiscal Committee or the Emergency Board. The Joint Fiscal Committee is made up of the 2 chairs of appropriations. I believe the 2 chairs, one in Ways and Means and Finance. And then there's 3 other members of the House and 3 other senators on there. So it's to look at the fiscal operation of our state government when we are not in session. So what we did is for this particular Capitol complex, FEMA decisions may need to be made off session to allow steps to be taken. We have put language that the 2 chairs, the chair of House Corrections and Institutions and Senate Institutions, would become members of Joint Fiscal Committee for the purpose of the Capitol complex and FEMA, so that there are decisions that could be made off session to go forward. So that's what Doug is talking about. We put the language in the Capitol bill last year to establish that. Mary?
So Doug, you were talking about 2023.
Mhm.
We had flooding 2024. all of the construction or the plans going forward based upon any additional damage that might have been done with the 2024? Or can you just focus on or do you have to focus on just the 2023 damage at this point and then address the other if there was additional damage?
So we get FEMA to agree to the budget. That budget's then used for what they call a 428 alternate project. And actually they have, I apologize for this, and I probably won't get it perfectly right, but they have an alternate project and alternative project, and they are very fussy about those two words, but it's 428 is the part that I think most matters. And what that does is it lets us take that budget and put it towards a plan that isn't a direct repair and replace and mitigation. A lot of it might be, right? But not every building might go back in exactly the same place. The 2024 floods did have some impacts on state government, but they were very light. Those floods, and they did hit Barrie pretty significantly, but they mostly hit the Northeast Kingdom. They mostly hit rural areas. It was more of a flash flood, fluvial erosion. It wasn't an inundation event. And so I think the way that that impacts the plans we're pulling together is that I think we're all much more conservative now than we were 3 years ago when we're thinking about floods and risk. So we're probably going to put together something that's protective of the buildings. And just the fact that we have had, 11 declarations in the last couple of years just makes us not want to repair and put things back in place. We know that we're going to get hit again. Unlike after Irene, I think there was a lot of the Waterbury complex was a great example of doing something differently because it was very glaring that something different needed to happen there. But there were many situations around the state where we did just repair and mitigate in place. And we thought Waterbury was a unique event and that we wouldn't have to worry about that again for another 100 years.
Well, and the work we did at the Waterbury complex in the rebuilding, when we had the flooding, 23, really proved that the work that we did protected that complex.
Yes.
Because if we hadn't done the mitigation that we did, I mean, we tore down, I forgot how many buildings, we tore down a dozen buildings.
We're down many buildings, filled in basements.
Yeah, filled in the tunnels, elevated, put in more saturation areas, floodplain areas to absorb the water. So when the flooding was happening here in 23 in the Capitol complex, I had my eyes on the Waterbury complex. That was the one that was like, is this gonna play out the way we had envisioned it when we rebuilt it? And it did play out.
It did. It suffered about $200 worth of damage to, I think, clean up the parking lot.
Yeah, and that, the parking lot was there to absorb it.
Yes.
As long as the vehicles were out of the way. You have something, Sean?
No, just so the planning is working like that.
Yes.
The plans work.
Yeah.
Connor, then Will?
Yeah, sure. Well, I just wanted to start thanking you, Doug. It's, we don't always agree with the administration on where to allocate and, where to put stuff, but a lot of credit to you, I think, just being sort of the middleman between municipalities, FEMA, the state. It's a tough gig. And we really had some good news this summer in Montpelier with, some of the FEMA buyouts and homes being elevated. And it felt like it was a long time coming, but like we needed that good news this summer. So that was great to see some of that come into effect. I was hoping you could update. I'm still very concerned about the audit that came out with emergency management, just showing that we had really only achieved a third of sort of the different points we wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of that's lack of staffing. COVID held it back certainly, but is emergency management in place to hit those targets sort of in a timely manner there? It's, I think we still have a lot of anxiety in town that, want to make sure we're doing everything we can to prevent this from happening again.
So that audit was an interesting one for me. I didn't disagree with the bare facts of the findings, but I think, and this isn't necessarily the auditor's job to put context on something, but to count the number of objectives we completed compared to our total list and then issue a percentage is reductive and unhelpful. Because many of those objectives are aspirational. When we put together the hazard mitigation plan, we work with partners collaboratively to elicit every possible way we could try to reduce risk in Vermont. And then we work towards achieving all of those, knowing that most of them we're not going to get to. And the number one priority on that list was achieved, which was establishing the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. Now, VM is still, the experts at VM still recommend, a persistent funding source for that. We don't need that quite yet because we have large amounts of one-time funding that we're still working our way through. But I think that long-term funding mechanism should be addressed in the work with the treasurer on the resilience implementation strategy. At the end of the day, we are doing more than 10 times the amount of hazard mitigation right now than we've ever done at any point in the past. So with contracted resources, with just the amount that Vermont can accomplish over the next couple of years, I don't think we could possibly work on more than we're working on right now. I think we do need to update the emergency management plan, particularly in the area of individual response and support. I did see a lot of, and we stood up a temporary bridge case management team for individuals. I do see a lot there that we have to do in emergency response and recovery. But as far as hazard mitigation goes, the $100 million that we have currently booked to spend on hazard mitigation, that's more than we've spent in the last 30 years in Vermont on hazard mitigation. So we're going to get a lot of great things done over the next 5 to 10 years. And so it was unfortunate to me, like the timing of that audit report was looking back at the last emergency management plan, like before we got resources. Now we have resources. And I do think we need to work for a couple of years and then listen to what the treasurer has to say about a persistent, like how do we support resilience going forward? Well, yeah, I think there were things in that report that don't acknowledge the reality that most things in hazard mitigation happen through either private property owners, municipalities, partners, in nonprofits. And the state doesn't have direct control over most of that. We can facilitate a lot of it and work on it. But at the end of the day, like the Harvey Farm in Waterbury is a great example. That would be a good mitigation project, but the property owners have already been very clear that they're not willing to sell the property. It's important to their family. So
Is that the one right on the highway?
it's in Duxbury. I think it's right on the highway. It would be one of the a reduction of the floodplain there so that it could store more water would significantly reduce the risk to downtown Waterbury. So I think that's the type of we've been pushing forward with a lot of voluntary projects. We're going to spend $100 million on those voluntary projects. But I think what do we do in those situations where that property is in Duxbury, if it was in Waterbury, Waterbury could take action, but Duxbury can't take action on behalf of Waterbury. So that's why I've been encouraging the Council of Governments conversation in Senate and House Gov Ops as well, because a regional group would be well positioned to weigh in on this is something important for our region and move those types of projects forward potentially.
That also, what's really at play there is property rights and who has.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, and-
fighting up against is property rights.
Yeah, I mean, I'll agree with you. What actually came to the front was Vermont government's not really designed to be able to handle this in many ways. When you see like, a community like Waterbury, widen the river 4 feet, right? And if, their neighbors don't do the same, we're in trouble all of a sudden. I think with ARPA funds, it was tough too. Remember, like they would go to the county, not the municipalities in some case. Yeah. So I'm really glad that conversation's happening.
So we have another question, Will?
So you mentioned the Flood Resilient Communities Fund. Can you go over that a little bit more and what that entails? Is that state or federal money that was put in?
Yes. So the Flood Resilient Communities Fund, when the American Rescue Plan Act state fiscal recovery funds, 1.05 billion.
It's ARPA.
That's ARPA.
The ARPA funds.
The ARPA funds were appropriated at the federal level in 2021. The Vermont legislature, like many other states, decided to appropriate because there was so much discretion in that money and it was
And
$1
how
billion.
How much did we get total? For ARPA?
We got 1.05 billion.
Billion with a B.
And so that was one of the major aspects of my job for the last couple of years, was overseeing the creation of those programs, making sure they're compliant with the federal rules. So the Vermont legislature appropriated about half of that money in the first year in 2021. No, sorry.
We lose.
There was some in 2021. Yes, it was half in 2021 and half in 2022. And then there were tweaks and modifications made in 2023 and then a tiny bit in 2024, but not much. So the Flood Resilient Communities Fund was created with those ARPA funds. It's been on our list as a priority, but some of our more pressing and time-sensitive human services needs, you know, in the budgeting process, you don't get to all of your priorities. So we had the extra $1 billion. That made it on the list as a priority. I think it was somewhere around 20 million. I'd have to look at the spreadsheet, but I know it was double digits, and I think it was 15 to 20 million. And it started with federal funds, but it was a state-run program, and it was intended to address the situations that FEMA won't cover. The way we fund hazard mitigation traditionally is that we have a disaster that impacts our infrastructure. Our public assistance is based on municipal damages, state damages, not federal highways, but municipal buildings, roads and bridges, or state buildings. That costs us, say, $100 million. And Irene was actually just over 200 million. So we haven't had any big disasters since Irene. So we were getting $10 million disasters, $15 million disasters. And then the hazard mitigation program from FEMA is 15% of that number. So if you get a $10 million disaster, 1.5 million is then granted to Vermont for hazard mitigation. And that's a 75-25 program. So we have to come up with 500,000 to match 1.5 million. So then we have $2 million we spend on hazard mitigation. But FEMA has very strict rules. And a lot of those rules focus on the FEMA maps of the floodplain, which with Vermont's topography and the way our rivers move and the way they're alive and the way we don't like to interfere with them, unlike other states, FEMA's flood maps are not accurate for Vermont. So you run into a lot of situations where you look at a hazard mitigation project, the town's on board, the property owner's on board. It's a good project. It'll help everybody involved. But FEMA looks through their rules and says it doesn't qualify because of this reason.
Doesn't meet the map. It doesn't meet the map that FEMA has.
Yes, the map or some of their rules, like they can run cost benefit analysis. Their formula for cost benefits gotten better over the last year or two, but it's still, it's still a limiting factor. Doesn't encompass everything. So that Flood Resilient Communities Fund was designed for the experts at VEM, which we actually, as a state, built Vermont Emergency Management Hazard Mitigation Program after Irene. We started investing in those resources about 13, 14 years ago now. And it takes a long time for state programs to build and gain momentum, but we now have several professionals in that section, and they move these hazard mitigation programs forward. That Flood Resilient Communities Fund was to give them more money to apply to projects that they've evaluated, they know are good projects, but the federal dollars don't exist to support those projects.
So do we still have much of the ARPA money left in there? Because ARPA monies have deadlines for encumbrance and then to get them out the door.
So ARPA money, we had until 12/31/2024 to obligate the ARPA money. And we have until 12/31/2026 to spend the money. There have also been several attempts by congressional Republicans to recapture unexpended ARPA funds. So that's been a political issue over the last couple of years.
Even if it's obligated, they're trying to.
So that's a point where like nerds like myself have been arguing over this for the last couple of years. There are a lot of people that federal practice in the past has been if something is obligated, then it's a legal agreement and you can't touch it. That is not actually true. That is precedent, that is civility, that is commonplace respect between governments and entities and organizations. It is not an ironclad law. Grants are always written with termination clauses. Federal grants in particular always allow for the federal agency to terminate at their discretion. If you read in the page 57 of the terms and conditions, there's always an option for the federal government to terminate an obligated agreement. They don't like to under normal course of business, I don't think it's impossible that the Trump administration could decide to deobligate funds. They did issue, they being President Trump, did issue, among many other troubling executive orders, a complete pause on disbursements of bipartisan infrastructure law and Inflation Reduction Act programs. So these are all obligated funds. These are all programs that are moving. And the executive order said, no one can send out any more money yet.
And that implies also to the ARPA funds, right? It's not.
Luckily, the ARPA funds were not included in any of the executive orders that I've been able to review and find. There's more than 50, so it's possible there's something buried in there I haven't found or I haven't had brought to my attention. I think that I would have found out by now if it included ARPA funds, because there's been a lot of scrutiny on those executive orders.
So what it has included is the IIJA funds.
Yes.
And that's a big impact. That's
Yes.
a big impact to us.
But they have said, they being the Trump administration has said, oh, oops, we didn't mean to impact infrastructure money. We like infrastructure money. So they want to attack equity. They want to attack,
Diversity.
people here. Yes. And climate action programs like weatherization programs. I think all of those programs are certainly at risk and have to go through extra processes and things.
So we got some more questions. Kevin and then Troy.
Well, I was wondering why a factual difference between the two organizations, i.e. the river's here, your map shows it here, that can't be reasonably resolved. And maybe it doesn't matter, but.
Ooh, how to not get myself in trouble with this one. FEMA operates in silos. They have different regions of the country, and every region of FEMA behaves differently. Traditionally, Region 1, we are in Region 1 of FEMA. Region 1 has had the fewest natural disasters of any region.
Recent.
Regions in the South have vetted professional staff that have worked through all of these things for years. They tend to get the most experienced and most professional staff in the southern regions because they're constantly getting hit with hurricanes and other disasters. So one of my major frustrations in working with FEMA is that no matter what response or commitment you get from FEMA, it can always be backed away from or changed later down the road. They don't agree to things. They don't make commitments, really. Eventually, we will get an obligation from them, but even that obligation, we could get one of their auditors that has a different perspective than the staff that obligated it, and they will say, nope, we decided these funds aren't, and they'll recapture. We've been pretty successful at fighting against recaptures since Irene, so we don't have a big problem there. It's just a minor frustration. But yes, there's no, and I've actually shared some of this with the delegation. Senator Welch has been very aggressive with proposing reforms to FEMA because it's a giant bureaucracy, and generally speaking, no one is actually responsible for anything.
Great.
Wow.
What-
Sorry.
No, but I hear you.
You get called to the carpet
The more experienced they are, the more flexible they can be with interpreting what reality is.
I think it comes down to the very experienced FEMA staff interpret the regulations, have confidence, make a decision, and move something forward. The regulations are so complex, the less experienced ones just wrap themselves around the axle and keep going around. The FEMA staff that have come to help Vermont, and like General Roy, the federal coordinating officer, they're great. They're great people. They've always had Vermont's best interests in heart. But it's just like a pinball game where things get bounced around in the machine of FEMA. And it's not the humans I have a problem with. It's the process and the structure. When a project manager works with us, tells us to submit something, and we submit everything they're asking for, it should move to the next step in the process. But what we've experienced over the last 2 years is we keep getting requests for information back. It's never good enough. And then eventually we get, and some towns make it through. If they had a really good project manager, that project manager anticipates all of the questions that aren't, clear that are going to be asked, and their project doesn't get challenged and it moves through. So a lot of it's been luck of the draw on which project manager a municipality gets, and which team we're working with at FEMA. But I would say they have all cared a great deal about Vermont and tried very hard. It's just been this,
It's caught up in the axle.
it gets caught up in the axle, and Department of Homeland Security is not known for, and I mean, as former military, I don't think they should necessarily be the most flexible organization. But unfortunately, FEMA is part of the Department of Homeland Security. So they come from that military structure and military process where, you know, they're not really focused on people as much as process and protection.
Right?
I'm gonna kind of tease this out because I don't know if I have a complete understanding. And I think it's probably something you've been asked before. I just haven't been able to track down any responses. And I want to go back to the unobligated ARPA funds. FY24 budget had that waterfall provision.
Yes.
Where first there was unobligated ARPA was going to go to FEMA, and then two chunks of money, 30 million and 25 million for housing initiatives.
Yes.
And I know joint fiscal gave the administration some pretty good leeway on how to manage that. I'm worried a little bit, and maybe you can explain it, and I'll leave that worry about how that, because I know there was kind of a reallocation of general fund items that were suddenly deemed ARPA eligible, which then freed up general funds that didn't have to go into that waterfall. And I'm worried that we left housing initiatives in, 55 million. Can you give me a sense of,
Yeah.
is that waterfall ever going to trickle? Like what happened? It feels a little bit like a shell game, but yeah.
Yeah. So there were, in Act 113 of 2024, there was a section dealing with the ARPA reversion process. So the first section of it gave the Agency of Administration the ability to do net neutral transfers of ARPA for general fund for programs that we projected would finish by 12/31/2026. We were allowed to swap the ARPA dollars, spend those ARPA dollars on a different expense that was eligible. In this case, it was rehiring of public sector capacity, payroll. So we put it against payroll for people hired after March of 2021, and then put that money directly back into that original program. So we weren't reducing the capacity or the dollar amount associated with that particular program. Then the next section of authority was the ability to revert funds if a program had completed or if it was not projected to complete by 12/31/2026. And so in AOA's initial projections, there were $47 million of reversions. So we would have done the full 36 million of ARPA or of hazard mitigation funding, 4 million for administrative costs of keeping limited service positions funded, et cetera. And then 7 million would have gone to affordable housing. In going back and forth with the programs that those reversions were going to come from, they disagreed with our estimates. We ultimately negotiated a reversion amount that ended up being $26.4 million. So they strongly disagreed with our projections for how quickly they could spend the money. The main reason being several programs hadn't spent hardly any money, like they had $25 million appropriations, and they'd only spent $1 million as of September 30th of last year. But they were also weatherization programs, so very high legislative priorities. And when we talked to the Joint Fiscal Committee, they said, your reversions should be agreed upon by the programs, by the subrecipients, in order to be considered unobligated.
Right.
So basically they were saying they were a little uncomfortable with AOA unilaterally reverting amounts that the subrecipients involved in the program didn't agree with.
Right.
So that's what happened. That's where $20 million stayed in the original programs. So AOA was only allowed to move money either out and then immediately back into the original program, or revert the money into the established waterfall. We didn't move the money anywhere else. And because if we used it to pay for payroll, we immediately took that general fund and we gave it back to the program that we took the ARPA funds from. So all of those, so we cured over $200 million of ARPA. So from a federal perspective, we're compiling a report right now that will show Vermont went from expending 550 million to 880 million in one quarter. We expended about 300 million federal dollars on paper. The cash is actually still, because we replaced general fund we'd already spent, the cash is still available for those programs. It's also available for the legislature to look at that general fund and this came up in Senate appropriations earlier in the week. That's general fund now. If the General Assembly chooses to reappropriate any of that, that is
So there's no waterfall provisions on that anymore.
right. So that waterfall was in effect only through 12/31/2024.
Right.
For any reversions and reallocations that the administration needs to perform from January 1st of 2025 forward, we compile those reversions and we have to get those explicitly approved by the Joint Fiscal Committee. They have to happen between existing ARPA programs. But VHCB does have an existing ARPA program, so technically we could appropriate money to them. AOA, the VEM appropriation is an existing project, so we'd be able to do that.
Will we know that on the 28th? Is that, will we know if you're gonna do that on the 28th?
Governor's budget.
With the budget, yeah.
There's been no additional reversions have been identified for the GovRec budget. I can say that. There was one bookkeeping oversight of 150,000 that we will be proposing a reversion and a transfer to the Joint Fiscal Committee at some point, but it won't be part of the GovRec construct. It would go through the Joint Fiscal Committee process that was established.
So is it accurate to state that the 30 million for VHCB and the 25 million for VHFA that were identified as potential recipients in that waterfall process currently are wondering if some of those general funds are gonna do that same thing?
Yes, I mean, I think the waterfall has been executed.
Yeah.
No additional funds
Yeah.
are anticipated there. In my testimony for the waterfall, I did say I doubt we'll get above 40 million much. I never
Yeah.
said we
Yeah,
would.
yeah.
I said it was extraordinarily unlikely we'd actually do the full 95, but we put a safety mechanism in there so in case we
Okay.
went over.
So there's still general funds that are meant to accommodate, that could potentially accommodate what was identified as waterfall recipients.
Yes, there are general funds sitting in what's an unusual practice, right? The legislature does appropriate 1 year at a time. So there are general funds sitting in programs that are multi-year programs.
Yeah.
That is unusual.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's been on Joint Fiscal Office and Joint Fiscal Committee's radar as well, that we have an unusual situation, right? With those general funds, and they want to make sure that the legislature maintains
Gotcha.
strict oversight of those funds.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna use probably wrong terminology to ask the question, but Ludlow is where I live and I represent. And our town manager has told us that to refurbish, restore the retaining ponds, lakes that protect the town from being flooded out will be $50 million project. They are
50?
$50 million project. And they're 50 years old, built by the Army Corps of Engineers. The message to the town when it's asked is the project has been approved, but FEMA does not have the money. Does that make sense? Even this, I mean, all the complication you just went through, I have no idea where the money is, but is that possible that somehow FEMA has said, yes, this is a worthy project, but we don't have the cash?
Yes, absolutely. So what FEMA is looking at with the wastewater treatment facility in Ludlow is what was the old plant? What would it cost to repair it and mitigate it in place? And then if you need to move buildings, if you need to shuffle things around, they won't pay for the delta in that, but they will pay $20 million of, that's what it would have cost to do it in place. And it's going to cost you 35 to move it somewhere else. Now, there are exciting opportunities coming down through USDA Rural Development from the Federal Disaster Supplemental that will help specifically municipal projects. But I don't think they would even get to that $50 million level. The problem with some of that number is that's what it would cost to redo the entire infrastructure. It hasn't failed yet, right? And part of it is, okay, how much do you spend on maintenance to keep this existing infrastructure going? So yeah, FEMA won't pay for upgrades. Hazard mitigation funds, if there's a cost benefit process done and it's shown that could be part of a hazard mitigation project. But we have about 100 million to spend on hazard mitigation, and about half of that so far has been consumed by property buyouts, which we are prioritizing property buyouts to get people out of harm's way. And then we're going to be trying to do floodplain restoration projects and other things like choke point mitigation, like bridges that are causing additional flooding in communities.
Were you talking about the wastewater plant or were you talking?
No.
You were
I was
talking,
gonna follow up on, that is another problem.
Right,
This
but
is,
you were-
this is more in the case that if the retaining ponds, lakes or whatever break, where it's been estimated, there's a 20-foot wall of water that will
Yep.
come down and to wipe out 220 homes in the level area. It would just decimate the whole thing,
Mhm.
which would basically wipe out Ludlow.
wipes out the
I mean,
town.
people, nobody's gonna come and buy property
No,
if that happens.
Wipes out the town.
So,
Yeah,
so, yeah, it's the mitigation, I guess, is what I'm asking about. So,
I think there's the A&R can speak to like dam safety but we have a lot of deferred investments that we need to make in our dam infrastructure. There's a lot of dozens, if not hundreds of situations across the state where risks from those types of dams need to be mitigated. And we are constantly,
Dams are, the other
they're
dams,
retaining ponds,
yeah,
but
Right,
the
so-
problem is they've been filled in,
right.
so they don't have the capacity, and once the water starts going over the
Yeah, they
top,
go over.
you're
it'll
done.
just
Yeah.
go.
Are those,
That's
are
the
those
fear.
ponds in Ludlow or are they further up like in Plymouth or Tyson or anything?
They're towards Weston,
They were towards West
Yeah.
Terrible Mountain
yes,
in that area?
exactly.
yeah. So that type of project can make it on the list as a hazard mitigation project. And it potentially might be able to access like dam safety, A&R programs, EPA programs. But from what I've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, it is challenging to find money for that type of project.
Because that's more important even than your wastewater system.
Oh, yeah, we'll lose the whole,
You'll lose the whole
nobody,
town.
nobody will buy
No,
anything
you
more.
lose the whole town.
Yeah, the town will be gone.
Yeah.
And it, between the age and the lack of maintenance, that's what's causing the problem now.
And that maintenance word is where FEMA and the federal government in general gets us, because the expectation is that we are spending a lot of money maintaining all of these structures, a lot of which were built by the Civil Corps of
Right.
Engineers.
Who owns those ponds? Is it the Army Corps of Engineer?
I don't know.
I mean, whoever owns them should be doing the maintenance.
Right.
I don't believe the Corps of Engineers is responsible for maintenance on any structures in Vermont. I could be wrong about that very easily. But none of my conversations have showed that
So
federal partners have a responsibility to pay for something
we
like
have a
that.
huge Army Corps of Engineer dam above Springfield.
Mhm.
That protects the town. And there's Army Corps of Engineer employees there.
Mhm.
So who would be doing the maintenance on that dam? It's a huge dam. And it was built in the late 50s, early 60s. So who would be doing the maintenance on that? Because we have Army Corps of Engineer folks around that dam all the time.
It's not Ben DeYoung, Ben. There's a Ben at A&R that leads the dam section.
Ben Green.
Ben Green, yes. He would be able to answer all of those questions very easily.
Love that,
We
Ben,
have
instead.
been there. We're talking to
A
Vermont.
lot of questions about right, so, yeah.
Under A&R, but these are Army Corps of Engineer dams that are not.
Right, but I think he maintains visibility on all of the different types of dams in Vermont, because some of them are regulated and overseen by PSD if they're energy producing, and by federal, like, it's a patchwork of responsibilities, yeah.
And that's part of the problem.
Yes, and some of them are fully private.
Yeah.
We've had some fully private dams or retaining ponds break that made things worse in events, yes.
That's what Kevin's talking about, is retaining ponds.
Yeah.
And you don't know who owns them or who maintains them.
I have never heard that the Army Corps of Engineers owns them, just that they designed them.
They
Because it was significant enough projects that 50 years ago, they said, hey, we gotta do something, so,
Right.
That was the flood that happened in the 70s,
yes.
73, 74. The flood got pretty wiped out during that flood.
I personally would love to have testimony to that, but
Now, we'll hook you up, you can hook up with a person within the Agency of Natural Resources.
thank you.
So What is the time frame? Is there anything you see us during this legislative session? And having to put in place outside of that joint fiscal committee, along with the two chairs of the institutions committee to act off session, is there anything you see that you're gonna need from us in the next few months? Or decisions that might be made that we can, in April or May, have to focus on? I don't want to put you on the
Yeah,
spot.
no, it's a good question, Madam Chair.
Governor's budget.
I do wish we were farther ahead with FEMA on the capital complex, but because we're not where we want to be, I think it's possible that during the session, we'll get a number from FEMA. And then when we look at that number and we peel it apart, see how they're constructing it, see how much, and if we can fight about that number to get it higher, or if we're satisfied with it, then at that point, whenever that happens, we can either make this committee or the outside of the session committee aware that, you know, we've hit a new milestone in the process with FEMA. Until we get that offer from them, I think it's challenging to even talk through alternatives and options. I think the one thing I didn't mention is that, and I think the special statutory committee obviously trumps it, but maybe we just need agreement from both parties that the capital complex committee would also have to be in agreement, I think, with any plan that we come up with.
Capital Complex Commission.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we're
That's
gonna have,
a stage
I
as
mean,
well.
there's some real decisions that will have to be made. If we have to move the mechanicals up, how many buildings is that gonna encompass, do you think? If we have to move the mechanicals up from the basement or first floor. I mean, some of these buildings are historic,
Right.
and if we have to move the mechanicals, is that even gonna be possible?
Yeah, 109 is really the only building that was majorly impacted that doesn't have a historic consideration. Even 133, most of it's not historic, but the facade is part of the historic district. So it pulls that in.
What about like where the Secretary of State's office is? The DMV, we don't have to worry about the auditor's building. That's not inhabitable right now. Is it?
Right, it's not.
And then 110 is that inhabitable? 110, 12, 110?
110 is, yes,
But if we move them, these were old homes.
right. And I think where the Arts Council is right now, Leahy Homestead, that's something we want to be very careful with how we address, very thoughtful.
How many buildings are inhabitable? 4? 4 buildings are not usable, right? We had with the Green Mountain Care Board,
Mhm.
we had with the Arts Council. We had the auditors.
Right.
There's one other. Is that that little welcome area, the welcome thing?
The Welcome Center is not active right now. We've been trying to figure out a good solution with Montpelier on where a Welcome Center might exist.
You mean the one down by the Christ Church or the one right over here, across the
Right over
street?
here.
Street. Okay.
Across the street, there was talk about putting it like downtown for a while this summer, but they can't find a good spot for it. It's because you want some parking too. It's
Because we have 4
Good
buildings,
luck.
right? 4 or
Yeah.
5 buildings. So here's the old, you know what would be really good? What would be really nice? Last year, there was a PowerPoint that was presented in terms of the damage.
Yes,
It was done and photos that were taken inside, some of the damages, and then talking about the buildings. It might be good if you find that PowerPoint, just send it to Phil, and maybe sometime as a committee, we could just go through that as a committee. Just to take a look.
The
at
video is
picture.
pretty tough to watch.
Yeah.
The water coming in with the time lapse there.
So people can get a
Which
copy.
is, yeah, it's definitely important to be able to understand the context of what you're trying to fix.
The Agency of Ag, are they back in that building?
yes.
They are. So we have.
That building suffered
That was-
less severe damage though.
But even then it was tough. So 110 was, we were gonna put that for sale, but that's kind of on hold, but you're back in there. 112 is a PUC commission. and Department of Public Service.
Mhm.
116, Agency of Ag, 118, Veterans Affairs. Isn't that one, the Veterans Affair, but is that still open?
I think that they were able to get that temporarily running, but I'm not certain. I think if we want to walk through the building by building, I think BGS, I'd be happy to come back and support them, but BGS has all of that and they're working through it. I know that they've been working through the site by site process with FEMA right now.
Because the Green Mountain Care Board, that's 144, that one's, then the Arts Council's next to it, 136, that was the Leahy Homestead.
Yep.
And then what's next to that, Leahy, next to the Arts Council, was the Visitor Center. It's 134, and then the auditor was 132. I think it's those four buildings got the biggest impact of that.
Yeah, I think what we do on that side of the river, I think is kind of a big question. Less of a question for me for the Secretary of State's building. That's such a historic and beautiful structure, and it actually made it through fairly well. So I think mitigation is reasonable for that site. But for a lot of those other buildings, you would have to elevate utilities 5 feet above the first floor. And that gets very challenging, right? So what do we do? How do we do that? But there are options.
So, yeah, so what I'm thinking is we're really not gonna be, there might be some decisions made on some of these buildings in the fall.
Yeah.
In terms, do we keep the building? Do we get rid of the building? Or do we try to move the mechanics in the building? That's gonna be done, and we're not in session unless things get so delayed, the next session we'll be dealing with that. That's a heavy lift for not having the standing committees being able to really. I mean, they can meet to help make a decision.
Right. I do think, I think we would need to make decisions at least to move a project forward in the fall. But just thinking of the timing with FEMA and how long a lot of this work is going to actually take place, I think that the legislative committees, like in January, could review and kind of ratify what was done out of session as well. I think there is time in the process to make adjustments if.
What about the flow of money? Because there's gonna have to be money for that. Is that part of the money that's already been set aside,
Yes,
used?
$30 million was set aside. Most of that is for the Capitol complex. We've used a couple million of it at this point. So most of the cash exists. We also have 48 million that we received for insurance proceeds, which I know you wanted to talk about, but I didn't get to it earlier. Most of that is being credited, like FEMA looks at how much we got for insurance and then just backs that out of the project. So that money has to be spent, in FEMA's opinion, on either replacing contents or repairing buildings. If we were to take that money and spend it on something else, then we would just be short on the repair project. So we essentially have 75 million, no, sorry. 75 million in cash to start that work. So even before getting a reimbursement from FEMA, we have sufficient cash to not be endangering the state's financial position. We have an allocation of insurance that we're negotiating with FEMA, and it's at the building by building level.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we'll have to do is that's sitting in the insurance fund. And once we reach a final agreement with them and the projects are locked in, then we would take that as a motion to the E-board. The E-board has to authorize any transfers out of the insurance fund. And we can make sure this committee and the Senate committee also know this is how we negotiated applying our insurance proceeds with FEMA, because insurance proceeds were also a big part of the Waterbury agreement, but we have more insurance now than we did in Waterbury. That was one of the things. We increased our insurance reserves after Waterbury. Irene.
I guess what plays into this for me is there's gonna need to be, for at least one or two of those buildings that, particularly one that's not usable right now. I would just like more voices to the table to make a decision on what to do with the building. That's what concerns me. Being done with obsession with a small handful of folks that may not understand the history of some of these buildings, or I don't know, it's just a gut feeling I have. These are major decisions on some of this, and it's not just how it impacts that individual building or the history of that individual building, but it impacts the Capitol complex and it impacts the community of Montpelier.
Right. I think it's also important that the state sets a good example in flood mitigation and balancing, resilient infrastructure with, the realities of our river. I'm saying we wouldn't propose a plan to just clear out of the space, right?
Right.
We also wouldn't propose a plan to just put things back in with a minimum level of mitigation, right? So I think finding that balance, I don't see any reason why the administration wouldn't be open to working on maybe a more robust process. I know Commissioner Minoli is extremely concerned with honoring the community and the historical district of the Capitol complex. So
She also has a history when we rebuilt Waterbury. It was a BGS, but I'm just thinking in terms of the legislative branch, because we're gonna be involved in the decision, but there's a lot of folks now who never went through FEMA, never went through rebuilding complex, or even have a real concept of what the Capitol complex is. Nobody thinks about these buildings around here and how that's the seat of state government and it's a designated area, Capitol complex. So I may be just blowing smoke, but I just have a gut feeling that this has to be bigger, more people need to be at the table for the decisions going forward. Than a committee and it's not disparaging the Joint Fiscal Committee or the Emergency Board at all, but it's the depth of knowledge or the depth of testimony that needs to occur to really understand what are all the options and are we doing the best option?
right.
Because it may be at a point with one of the buildings, just moving the mechanicals in the building. It's like, whoa, do we really want to spend that kind of money? Is it really feasible, or is it better to do something different with that building, even though it's being used now? Those are tough decisions to make.
They are. And unfortunately, like even presenting a plan requires a lot of work and piecing together the numbers. And we need those people focused on providing FEMA with all the information to agree to a project budget. So we haven't been able to divert our resources to that more planning and alternatives analysis because FEMA hasn't been satisfied with the initial data yet.
Right, so once you get to that point, being able to do the planning, FEMA then signs off, everybody agrees. The legislative then hasn't had that background. They haven't had any of that background. I look at the current Joint Fiscal Committee makeup, except for maybe a senator from finance is the only one that was around. I mean, everybody else is so new to this, and then they're being asked to make a decision.
We do intend to engage as soon as we're able to start constructing alternatives. We do intend to engage with the Montpelier Flood Commission and in that way pull in Montpelier and make sure the community perspective is addressed as well. So I think hopefully that will help, but it doesn't completely mitigate, Madam Chair, what you're worried about.
Yeah, I'm just concerned. I'm just trying to figure out how to work it through come July, August, September, October, before we get back here in January. That's all. I just,
In fairness, we might still be here dealing with education.
oh God, I hope. Let me tell you, when we did Act 60, there was one year, we were here until the middle of June. Doing financing stuff.
I was just bringing levity, but
Oh, that was helpful.
you're welcome. I was just gonna say, I mean, I would agree with you. I don't. like a major, nothing to do with you guys, by the way, but I don't like major decisions being made outside the body. I know it's the way the system's set up, but it is beyond this for me, but we'll keep it to this. But it is what it is. Hopefully it can be done quicker, but if not, it's,
I would definitely big second as well, Chair. I'd love to spend some time looking at what that process looks like and make sure all the voices are at the table here. It's I think in Montpelier, many of these decisions, you feel like the existence of the town depends on it, So we want to be good neighbors with the state and vice versa.
Vice versa.
I think the reason we asked for the out of session approval process was hoping FEMA would move faster on some of this.
Right.
At this point, with the way things are kind of incrementally chugging along, we might not need to make any binding decisions until the capital bill process next year anyway. Or even if it had to happen faster than the capital bill, it could at least happen through the committees and maybe a standalone bill during the session.
I'm just thinking what we did with the Waterbury complex, because we had contracted when we lost Waterbury, the complex, and that happened in August, September. The administration at that time put together a group of folks from a lot of different entities to kind of figure out how do we move forward. Do we demolish the complex and just leave it demolished? Do we mothball it? Do we renovate it, reconstitute it? Do we bring it back where it was? I mean, there was a lot of decisions that had to be made, and they put together a whole group of folks, and then the administration contracted out with French Freeman to come back with options in terms of what do we do? Do we have a small complex there and then lease space elsewhere? Do we rebuild to what it was before? Do we raise it? Whatever we do. And they came back, it was kind of like the middle of January, they came back to this whole group with, I think they had 5 or 6 options and different price tags for each option. And the group just kind of coalesced around 2 options. But it wasn't solidified enough for the legislature to really act on that. And we spent that legislative session in this committee looking at all the options. And we were kind of going between the 2 options, but nothing was real definite. And that's why we put together the joint fiscal committee with the 2 chairs, because during the summer and fall, we knew we'd get more information coming back to make a decision on which option. And that's why for the Capitol complex, for these buildings, we have the joint fiscal committee with the 2 chairs. That's the model that we're doing going forward. Would there be a possibility of different options that would be put forward to that joint fiscal committee this year?
Oh, yes,
There would be
absolutely. I think the high level intent at this point is to present no less than 3 options, probably 3 to 4 options on how to kind of a minimum mitigate, like this is a codes and standards kind of version, right? Where we do the minimum investment necessary to meet our flood hazard rule, kind of just to show a baseline to everyone of this is all the law requires us to do. So we'll produce that. And then 2 options that are in kind of the middle of, well, these are different ways that we can preserve the character of the complex, but move things around a little bit, replace the square footage. I think replacing the square footage we lose to the utilities moving or setting up the utilities separately. That's where you see a lot of the widgets being moved around. And then probably the most aggressive option we would show is like where we, open up more green space on that side of the river, but we still preserve the same amount of office space in the Capitol complex, giving the river as much space as possible. But I think even that, I'm not asking anyone to produce an option where that whole side is just green, right? I don't think we would ever go that far as to propose something like that. Because it also doesn't, you have to, when you're doing that, you also need to look at how much flood mitigation, how much benefit does that actually buy Montpelier from a like water level perspective? And it would be minuscule, right? So we'd be losing a lot of character, we'd be losing a lot of history for very little statistical safety and gain for Montpelier, especially since it's on the downstream side of the town. So I think Waterbury, because of the topography, I do think required much more dramatic reconfiguration. And I don't expect the options with the Capitol complex to be as different and as aggressive as Waterbury had to be.
So the language we have for this special committee that we put in last year's capital bill said the special committee would meet to review and recommend alterations to proposals and plans for the Capitol complex flood recovery. And that the committee may, as necessary, grant approval to proposals and plans for Capitol complex flood. That was the language. So that implies that there would be more than one proposal
Yes.
and plan. Sean?
You know, my naivete, being a builder. So 132, 134, and 136. I mean, if it was me and someone came to me and said, what's the easiest, cheapest way for me to save these buildings and be able to keep them out of the floodwaters, is just raise them all. It's not that
kind of raise?
just
Raise.
no, lift them up. No, but that's actually not that expensive. It's really not that. It's not that crazy. And you keep them, and you raise them up 10 feet, and build you build a new basement underneath it, or something that's going to be able to deal with water. And I would do that to those 3 buildings right there. That can go.
That's gonna go.
144, that's useless. That has no architectural value. But the other 3, just raise them up. And what?
Let's do this all.
And I know that's like, you can do, I mean, I just got bids to raise a 200-year-old house, and it's like 4,000 square feet. It's brick, it's huge, and we could do it for like 150 grand. I mean, and that includes moving all the electrical and plumbing and everything downstairs, and dealing with their septic. And doesn't seem like a lot of money to me. But anyway, I just had to say that.
Here.
Yeah, I think I think if we hadn't hit so many detailed points of contention with FEMA, we would have already we would be coming into this session presenting this committee with multiple options on how to approach the Capitol complex. Elevating the buildings individually would definitely be an option we presented. Elevating the buildings on something of a plateau with a facing similar to, so you could continue the optics from the DMV, is probably another proposal we might construct. HP Cummings has been maxed out responding to FEMA's request for information and requests for things to be presented differently and code reviews and all those things. So we haven't been able to construct those primarily because we just need to get past this first base. But I agree with you that elevation is certainly an option. Elevation is to keep the buildings in place and meet code. Elevation will be required of at least 4 to 5 feet in most buildings. And then the question is, do the utilities go somewhere else in the building, or do you build a small camouflaged utility structure next to it? And that's where a plateau could help, because then you're just building those little utilities on a plateau. And then you need to remove fill from somewhere else, because if you're building a plateau, you're impacting the floodplain of the rest of the city of Montpelier. And so if you're adding fill here, you need to take away fill closer to the river. And so then how do we reshape our parking lot? How do we address the retaining wall that the Army Corps of Engineers built years ago? So yes.
I look at it more like the houses in like Long Beach Island, where they've had to raise them all down in New Jersey, and they're on posts, and all those floors are designed for water to flow through them and for the building to not go anywhere. So I'm not looking at it as bringing in fill. Maybe the outside facade could look pretty. Maybe you have to do that. I don't want to get in like, I mean, we're in the weeds, but I'm just saying that doesn't necessarily have to happen either.
True. I mean, if we're going to reoccupy the buildings, then they need to be elevated in some way. So it's in the Leahy homestead, I think a legitimate question could be, does it get elevated or does it get moved? Do we want to preserve the building and the history there? But maybe, I mean, we've moved historic structures before to keep them safe.
There's a lot of houses around town. We've moved around them, you know.
That's what, instead, it's already something that was under consideration. It's just, it takes super long time with FEMA and government coming.
That can happen, but I think age. I'm sorry.
So hang on here. So Mary has a question. Joe, you have a
At
question?
this point, have you done any of that preliminary assessment? If that, something like that could be done with the cost amount, or are we waiting for FEMA to come up with what they're? I guess I'm looking at as this time keeps going by, where are the plans and what are the priorities going forward? And, you know, hearing that, and maybe it was simplified by my fellow member a bit, but 150,000 and raising up a building is a lot less than some of the other major things we've been talking about. So have you done different versions of plans that you're looking to propose at this point? Or is that all on hold till FEMA gives the go-ahead?
People did start working on alternatives analysis, but I told them they had to focus on getting the budget locked in with FEMA, because we also are at risk of losing that funding from FEMA because there are deadlines on when we just no longer get any federal assistance. And I think that's the tough spot I've been in. I can talk with the team and see anything we were able to put together would pull resources from the people I need focused on developing that budget with FEMA.
But how do you move forward if you don't have proposals kind of in front of them for them to approve or not approve?
Because they're not basing their budget off of the proposal of what we actually want to do. This is a logical inconsistency that's just a core part of FEMA. They will only base what they're going to pay us off of what it would cost to mitigate each building separately in place. Just that building by itself, one by one. And then they have to approve our plan for what we actually want to do with the money. But the step one is getting them to agree to, okay, to repair and mitigate in place, it would be $180 million for FEMA. You've applied 40 million of insurance, so FEMA will pay for FEMA's covered share of that is 140 million. So you need to pay 14 million of cost share, and we will pay 126 to the state of Vermont in order to make that project work.
It's project by project.
It's project by project.
It could be even an individual project in one of the buildings.
Right.
Is that true? Because that's what it was in others.
Right. But a big part of this is, we've talked about 144, for example. I think most of us not really thinking we're going to keep that building around. But for an alternative project, FEMA calculates how much it would have cost to repair and mitigate that building in place. And then we get financial credit on that building towards the rest of the project cost. And also FEMA they will not go to step 2 unless step 1 has been completed. It's very procedural, and they will not move past this step at this point. So I think that's
Right, I'm not.
Yeah.
It just seems the process is kind of backwards, but.
I have said that, and I agree with it.
It just
That's why you said
needs to
it.
know what a box of money is. And then we'll have some concept of where that money goes or what happens, but then you do the refinement after.
Right.
I mean, that's.
We have this here during Waterbury, I understand that, but it just seems like when government gets involved with any of these projects or that, the money's through the roof, it's this, that, the other thing, and you're going around the wrong way to get to the end result. But that's just my humble opinion.
Right.
Joe?
Just a comment regarding historic structures, typically the preservations get really grumpy if you're trying to move something. There has to be really almost just no alternative.
Yes, pretty much every building in the complex, the SHPO, the State Historic Preservation Officer, needs to be in agreement with the plan. Our current SHPO cares very deeply about protecting the buildings. And so elevating it or moving it, she is going to be supportive of that. Things that, would damage, especially the roadside facade of the buildings. I mean, she's not going to let us do things that really impact in a negative way how it looks from the street. But if it can be camouflage, if it can be something that's subtle and hidden by bushes, I don't know. We might be able to get things like that approved.
And please know Connor won't allow you to do that either.
Well, I don't know if this has been helpful or not, but I wanted to at least bring the FEMA conversation to the committee as well as what we're facing with the Capitol complex, because it's out there and we're just, for this committee and everything, we're just kind of on hold. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be aware of what's coming down the pike. And I'm really concerned about some major decisions being made about how we move forward off session. And I know we've set this special committee up. I'm going to check with our ledge council to see if we have to do if this carries through going forward here, or if we have to revamp it. Should include some language in the Capitol bill that we'll be doing this session. Check in with that. Because I do want something in place off session. And the other thing we might also want to do is allow the authority for this committee to get together off session a couple of times to look through when things start going forward with these buildings. And we have a decision from FEMA for this committee to meet to at least get the information. We can't do any formal act, but we can make a recommendation to the joint fiscal.
Right.
Well, we're gonna have to put language in to allow that to happen.
Right. Well, yes, changes of this magnitude in the Capitol complex, I think, should try to achieve the maximum of legislative involvement. And I think the only reason to retain the exception process for out of session and maybe bolster it so that it's got more involvement is